morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this expert panel from the GFA FA 2022 from Berlin. And we're going to be looking in this panel at multi-dimensional soil health, pathways to incentivize improvements in this session organized by FCDO. My name is Rachel McDonnell, and I'm the Deputy Director General at the International Water Management Institute. We see around the world that public support and public policies make a major contribution to influencing what we grow and how we grow that. And we know this is up to $700 billion worth of investment by those governments. And yet what we hear from the UNFSS, the UN Food Systems Summit, from the COP26 in Glasgow recently, is that the damage some of those harmful practices bring to our landscapes, and particularly to our soils, is something that we really need to address as we see the growing impacts of climate change and the degradation of that natural resource base that we rely on to grow our food. So what do? We have an incredible opportunity. Agriculture and soils can be very much part of the solution to bringing the change that's needed to transform our food systems. So what we want to do in this session is to really look at what role do policies, and in particular, do incentives, what can they bring? Can we repurpose those incentives so they can bring better practices into our agricultural producers? How can they support those agricultural producers take on board new possibilities, new ideas in looking after our soil health across this multi-dimensions that is involved there? This session will highlight and discuss policy approaches and opportunities for this repurposing to look at how we support land users to improve soil health in all its dimensions. The expert panel that's joining me today, our 6 panelists, come from across the world, different geographies, but different perspectives as well, from policymakers to farmers' voices to academia. And what is important is this event is part of an ongoing dialogue. These are known as the Policy Dialogue on Accelerating Transition to Sustainable Agriculture, co-convened by the UK government and the World Bank. And this is very much taking forward some of the aims of the policy action agenda that was launched at COP26. Joining me in this session, I am delighted to introduce, for our opening statements, we will have Dr. Wolfgang Zornbach, the head of unit of the Climate Change and Sustainability, the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture. We'll also have an opening statement from Madhav Gautam, who is the lead agricultural economist, agriculture and food global practices at the World Bank. And then we will have a series of short inserts, presentations from around the world on those initiatives and incentives to look at this repurposing. We have Lee Winowicki from World Agroforestry, who's going to give us a global perspective, and she's joining us from Nairobi. We have a national perspective from Sean McGeever, who is the Deputy Director of Access Landscapes, Peatlands and Soil from the UK's Department of Agriculture, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So thank you for joining us from the UK. And then we look at the farmer's perspective, which is so critically important. We have Esther Panuna joining us from the Philippines, and she's the Secretary General of the Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development. And then the research perspective, because we know its research is going to drive some of the new solutions that are coming through. We have Professor Edward Rhodes from Njala University in Sierra Leone. And it's a wonderful to have such a different set of voices joining today. So this session is going to be in 2 parts. The first part, we are going to hear from the panelists, and we will have 3 to 5 minutes from their inserts. And then we want to hear your questions. We will be having a 25 minutes question and answer session. And we really want you to be engaged with us, bring your insight, but also the questions you want to ask our panelists. So please add those to the chat, and we will be monitoring those chats. Keep adding them as the session goes on, and we will be monitoring them. And at the end, we will take both questions from the chat as well as through raised hands. So first, I'd now like to ask Dr. Wolfgang Zornbach to open our statements. Thank you, Wolfgang.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to give this opening statement. we are really proud that we are part of the policy action agenda for transition to sustainable food and agriculture, and that we are one of the countries which endorse this policy action agenda. And I was asked to tell you some few words about the German approach, how we deal with sustainable agriculture, because sustainable agriculture is in fact not really new. We are not starting at the point zero, but we need transition to more sustainability, to more climate related agriculture policies. And in the center of our policy, we see the farmer, the farm, but also the consumer. The consumer plays a very important role in the whole context. And the participative approach is, let's say, it's daily practice in our work. So it's not only policymakers deciding on laws and regulations, we are talking to the farmers and to the consumers as well. And as you may know, Germany is a federal country. We don't only have the federal government, where I'm working for, we also have the governments of the federal Länder, and we have shared responsibilities regarding legislation, implementation, and that's something we have to have in mind. Our policy mix is made of laws and regulations, of course, but also a lot of incentives, also research, demonstration farms, extension services, and of course, very important part of the whole story is communication. Looking at our climate change action program, there are elements on soil, of course, very important elements. Right this year, we start with a humus program. We spend about 4 million euros each year for demonstration farms all over the country. And we also will start with the peatland program. And that's not only some few million euros, we will spend hundreds of millions during the next years. That's a long-lasting program. But Germany is not the planet. So what is really needed over the planet is need for information exchange, for more communication from each other, like we do here within the GFFA, but also in other arenas, like the Kuronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, which is part of UNFCCC negotiations, or also led by the policy action agenda. So that could be a very important element of the whole story. Because we have to have in mind that if the Paris Agreement works, in 2050, agriculture will be the only sector emitting greenhouse gases. And in this context, soil health as sink for greenhouse gases is a really important issue. And I would like to encourage all governments and stakeholders worldwide to cooperate, to exchange their views, to exchange their experiences, and join the worldwide dialogues which are ongoing and which will hopefully increase during the next years. One final word, Germany is also presidency of the G7, first half of this year. And during that presidency, we will have an agriculture ministers conference also in May. And we will address sustainable food systems, in particular deforestation-free food systems, and carbon farming, which is also an important issue if we talk about incentives for farmers, if they are able to sequester carbon in their soils. So with these few words, I hope I covered the 3 minutes. I say thank you very much and wish you a wonderful expert panel.
Thank you, Dr. Wolfgang. And you've brought up so many important issues, multi-levels of governance. We have incentives at many different levels. And the real reason we have to bring farmers and consumers, as well as researchers, as well as policymakers together, to endorse those changes and to catalyze those changes, to take those changes to school and, of course, the private sector. So thank you. And we really welcome you taking what comes from this session to the G7 to continue this journey of policy dialogues. So thank you very much for your time. And now I'd like to ask Madhav Gautam to bring his thoughts to this here. Over to you, Madhav. Thank you, Rachel.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I want to start with repeating a couple of messages that Rachel delivered earlier. And the two messages are from the two recent major global events. From the UNFSS, we heard the urgency to transform today's food system so it can continue to feed a growing population with less impact on climate and nature while delivering better nutrition and higher incomes for farmers. At COP26, the Sustainable Agriculture Campaign stressed the need to rethink how agriculture needs to be supported to achieve such a transformation. At a time when farmers bear the brunt of the worsening climate change and volatile markets and shifting consumer demand, government support is very much needed. In this context, a core question is whether the massive support provided to agriculture by governments can be used differently to deliver better outcomes for people, the planet, and the economy, the so-called triple wins. A new study by the World Bank, which we have just completed and released this week in partnership with IFPRI, on repurposing agriculture policies and support options to transform agriculture and food systems to better serve the health of people, economies, and planets, addresses these questions and affirms that there are indeed options that can achieve the triple wins. If left in place, the current system of support would increase agriculture's impact on climate and nature. It also delivers low value for money, with only 35 cents in returns to farmers for every dollar of public support. The study evaluates several repurposing options, but finds that not all of them are equal. Some have important trade-offs, but a key finding of the study is that repurposing domestic support to develop and adopt green innovations that both reduce emissions and raise productivity could deliver substantial triple wins. While we need to repurpose agriculture policies and support, how do we go about doing this, a highly complex undertaking? Agriculture accounts for a third of greenhouse gas emissions, but ironically, agriculture is one sector that has the potential to substantially help improve the climate through carbon sequestration, and land and soils have a critical role to play in this. And while agriculture's impact on climate is felt globally, agricultural policies and support are essentially domestic actions, calling for a coordinated international effort by all countries to achieve meaningful gains in climate change. But no one solution fits all. Each country has its own set of challenges and needs to identify options and strategies that best serve its development goals. To meet this challenge, as part of the Just Rural Transition campaign over the past year, the UK government and the World Bank co-convened a series of global policy dialogues to facilitate sharing of experiences across countries on actions they have taken to redirect their policies to promote sustainable agriculture. The policy action agenda that emerged from these dialogues sets out the pathways and actions countries can take to repurpose their policies in support of sustainable agriculture. The agenda was launched at COP26 on Nature Day. In addition, under its Food Systems 2030 initiative, the World Bank is providing technical assistance support to countries interested in to identify policies and implement actions to repurpose how they support agriculture. Looking forward to 2022, we will continue to facilitate cross-country knowledge and experience sharing in partnership with the UK government and maintain the momentum to mobilize support for policy action agenda. And we will also continue to support countries in implementing suitable policy actions to transition to more sustainable agriculture and food systems. With that, I want to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. And how fascinating. You bring the farmer to us, highlighting that the farmer really is bearing the brunt of climate change. We see that increased droughts, increased floods, changing rainfall patterns. And then we have changing consumer patterns. And yes, that's important for health and for the health of the planet. But there is an economic cost to that. And looking at how those incentives can bring that change, help bring the solutions that we know into practice across many different people who maybe not have access to some of that knowledge or the ability to invest in some of those. I think it's really important. That report sounds fascinating. We're all going to be looking and reading that afterwards. Thank you, Madha. And now we want to look at some of those different perspectives. Our first speaker is Lee Winowicki, who we're delighted to meet you, and we're wanting to hear the global perspective. Lee, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I am thrilled to be here. I am Lee Winowicki, a soil scientist at C4E-Craft based in Nairobi, working on international research and development issues around scaling farmer-centered soil health and ecosystem restoration practices. I also co-lead the Coalition of Action for Soil Health, which took root in the UN Food System Summit and continues to grow. And I think this year's GFFA kicks off 2022 in the absolute right spirit. We start this super year with 3 COPs to come, placing soil health at the center of the global agenda to transform food systems, to address climate change, and to reach ecosystem restoration targets. So I'd like to make just 3 short interventions. First, we are at an incredibly exciting moment in time, in fact, a turning point in terms of not only our access to big data, but our ability to translate these data into knowledge and action. And Wolfgang just talked about the information exchange. So this is what I'm talking about. There's been a monumental behavioral shift in the science community to make sure these data no longer sit on shelves collecting dust, but that it's accessible and it's used to facilitate evidence-based decision-making for achieving impact. That includes decision-making that Madhur just talked about on the ground by farmers. That includes policy decision-making as well as financial investments. This has also raised the standards for the data sets we generate, including soil data sets. For example, that they are both robust, but they also have relevance at the global and local scale. For example, at C4E-Craft, we have dedicated the last 2 decades to fill the gap on soil and land health data by building systematic georeference databases of soil health indicators across the global tropics. This allows us to connect field observations with remote sensing to produce accurate maps and assessment. These data are critical for de-risking investments in soil health, for allowing governments to include soil health in policy, because now we are able to link how soil stewardship impacts soil health indicators, which brings me to my second intervention. The Coalition of Action for Soil Health was launched at the UN Food System Summit, already referenced by Wolfgang and Madhur, because as we are aware, and as Rachel opened, land degradation is a major challenge, and it is an increasing problem, reducing the resilience of ecosystems and livelihoods. So clearly, we need to redouble our efforts, and there is a need for innovations and stakeholder actions. So the overarching goal of the coalition is simple: improve soil health globally by addressing critical implementation, policy, and investment barriers that currently constrain farmers and pastoralists from scaling healthy soil practices. Now, if you caught it, the acronym of the coalition is essentially CASH, which highlights one of our key niches. We aim for a 5 to 10-fold increase in investment in soil health, which will translate into transparent and equitable financial incentives to the farmer. We have an enthusiastic and growing partnership of member states, research organizations, civil society, private sector, and NGOs. The coalition is anchored within the UNCCD, and it is with this diverse membership that we aim to create an enabling environment to support evidence-based policy for scaling soil health investments. And finally, my last point, building on what Madhur said, when we are talking about improving soil health, scaling soil health practices, it is critical that farmers, pastoralists, and land managers are at the center. These are the stewards of the land, and innovation is critical. in order to meet their needs and their local context. As we just heard, there is no one silver bullet in terms of intervention, which means we're moving toward a knowledge-intensive system. So this innovation is key to successful scaling of healthy soil practices. In closing, it is this paradigm shift in translating deep domain knowledge into action to facilitate evidence-based policy and financial investments that support this farmer pastoralist innovation to contextualize and scale soil health solutions.
Thank you, Lee, for joining us from Nairobi and bringing this from the field and from your research centre, all the innovations there, that data you spoke about, this coalition that sounds a fantastic group of all the people who should be talking together, and that's good. And of course, you're bringing the farmers and making them central to what is needed, what sort of support they need to be able to bring on these sustainable practices that are going to look after our soils for the next generation of farmers coming through. So thank you very much for that, Lee. And now I'd like to ask Sean McGeever to bring the national perspective. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you, Lee, for that injection of energy and call to arms there and that sort of global perspective. So I'll bring this down to what we're doing in the UK. As Rachel said, I'm the Deputy Director that leads on policy for soil health, but also for access to nature and landscapes and peatlands. So the clue there is that, you know, what we're trying to do here in the UK is bring nature and farming together in the ways that it really, really should do, because obviously our food production depends on our natural systems. So, like, you know, many parts of the world, soil degradation is a big problem in the UK. We estimate that in England and Wales, it costs between 0.9 billion and 1.4 billion pounds per year, just due to remedial action. It also results in loss of productivity, and it has negative impacts on our rivers. Water management and water quality leads to flooding, which sometimes you may see in the news in the UK we're increasingly suffering from, and makes us more vulnerable to climate change. Just as an example, in terms of the scale of soil degradation that we have seen over the past decades, in East Anglia, which is a region in the east of England, we've lost about 84% of our peat soils. And if we don't change our practices, we estimate that we will lose them all in the East Anglian Fens in the next 30 to 60 years. So things have to change. So I'll try and explain to you very quickly and briefly, and there'll be a chance for questions later, what we're doing. Essentially, the big idea is that we're transitioning from existing subsidies and payments that we give to farmers. And most of the land outside of cities in the UK is owned by farmers, it's privately owned. And it's private landowners and farmers who are going to have to bring about this change. It's not something that we can do on sort of large tracts of government land. So we're transitioning from a system where we pay the existing set of subsidies to a set of incentives that will deliver on environmental outcomes. And this is called the Environmental Land Management Schemes. And it started already. There are 3 levels of this. The first level is called the Sustainable Farming Incentive. The next level is called Local Nature Recovery, which has sort of slightly more agroforestry, wildflower borders, more sort of nature recovery elements. And then the sort of third level is called Landscape Recovery. That's where either large landowners or groups of farmers can come together to totally recover the ecosystem services on a landscape scale. An example of this would be large-scale peatland restoration, or where you would have perhaps sort of what we now call a rewilding project, where you try and bring in elements of restoring ecosystem systems that existed in a wilder environment, but also with some food production. So I'm going to talk specifically about this Sustainable Farming Incentive at the moment, because that's the first one we're rolling out, and that's where soil health is really at the core. And what we're doing here is providing incentives for specific outcomes that farmers can do to improve on soil health and to deliver not just on food production and sort of sustainable the sustainable management of soil, but also on environmental outcomes and climate change. And we've touched also on sort of carbon capture, but also reducing emissions and all of the other elements which are around adaptation like flooding and flood management. So the way that it will work is that we will have a set of standards. We've got 2 standards that have been rolled out already. These are improved grassland soils and arable and horticultural soil standards. These standards encourage practices such as the introduction of herbal lays, the use of grass legume mixtures, cover crops, and actions that build levels of soil organic matter and avoiding compacting wet soil. The soil standards pay for actions that go beyond regulatory requirements and existing widespread good practice to improve soil health. So this is not just about regulation, this is about incentives. As Rachel said, this is a core part of what we're talking about today. And we're also working to ensure that all of these 3 ELM, environmental land management schemes, enable the blending of public and private finance, and that the public money doesn't crowd out private investment. So we're trying to get those incentives just right so that we can get that balance. And we want farmers and land managers to be able to participate in our schemes, but also take advantage of opportunities to access emerging ecosystem service markets. And we're also helping to promote that and create those links. Beyond this, we are developing a soil action plan for England. This will be a single strategic and coherent plan for multiple outcomes. So it'll encourage land management practices that are sensitive to both soil health, the environment, and food production. It will outline how soil health improvements can help deliver against our wider environmental targets, including our now legally binding target to halt decline in species abundance by 2030. That's in national law. The main themes of the action plans are prevention, protection, including resilience and adaptation, and improvement. And across these themes, actions are being developed to mitigate and adapt to both immediate and future risks of the impacts of climate change on soil health, and to protect against and reverse soil degradation. At the core of this, and Lee, this is, builds on your data, is the development of a healthy soil indicator. We need to be able to measure the changes in soil health, bad and good, and we need land managers to be able to do that easily. And we need to collect all of that data so that we can see trends and adapt our policy. So there's going to be a really big push on that, and the indicator has to be something that we can measure on the ground easily with basic equipment, so that we can keep that collection of data alive and sustainable. Essentially, by encouraging a more holistic approach to protecting and improving soil, we believe we will increase the practice of sustainable soil management, we'll increase the health of our soil, and help all our ecosystems thrive. Because if they thrive, so do we. Rachel, in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but there'll be questions and answers in a deep dive later, so we can touch more on measuring and monitoring and data and so on at that point. I'll also be joined in the deep dive by some members of my soil team and the environmental and management team. So if you have quite technical questions, they'll be there to help answer those as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. And that was a fantastic insight on this steps towards repurposing subsidies, moving towards incentives, and for also highlighting that loss of soil has many consequences. Yes, you gave us some numbers for the economic losses of productivity, but how those soil losses, how they affect water systems, how they bring flooding, and how they, it's not just benefits that can be from the land and from agricultural production, but we have to think about it at this landscape scale. And it's fascinating to hear about the moves to support things like rewilding, yet we know that can be controversial. So looking at the private-public interventions and where we can do. Thank you, Sean, for also highlighting the questions. So please do add your questions into the chat. We are monitoring this and we are looking forward to it. And as Sean also mentioned at the end, and I will talk a little bit more at the end of our session, there will be deep dives. 3 of our panelists will be available. So it's almost like stepping out and having a cup of coffee with them. They will be there for half an hour for you to join them to really go into some of the details that's emerging from our conversations already today. And then our next speaker is Esther Panuna, who is going to give us the farmer's perspective. Esther, over to you. We really are looking forward to your voice from the Philippines in this.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello to everyone. We thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity to share our perspectives on incentivizing soil health. And we have 3 key interventions on this. First, what are the role of family farmers? 4 key points here. Family farmers dominate the farming landscape and they produce 80% of the world's food. Amongst family farmers, though, a very large majority, or 84%, are small scale, and that means working on lands 2 hectares or less. Most of these, or around 80%, are in Asia Pacific, in our region. Our membership, for example, in AFA, 22 member organizations in 16 countries with around 13 million members, is made up of small-scale women, men, and young farmers engaged in crops, livestock, fisheries, aquaculture, herding, and pastoralism. And when we talk about processes or elements in the food system, from production to processing, to marketing, to distribution, to consumption, preparation, and generating waste in the process, family farmers are involved in all these key processes. Thus, we believe that family farmers are at the heart and at the center of any transformation for food system. Second aspect, how do we view soil health? 5 points here. First, the soil provides essential nutrients, water, oxygen, and support to the roots, all elements in favor of the growth and development of plants for food production. That's why healthy soil is healthy food production. The soil, however, is an important component of land. No land, no soil. And for us, land is life, because in land, there is soil and much, much more, like minerals, mountains, streams, water, there is community and belonging. However, much of the soil and much of the land is degraded. In fact, our food system is broken by chemical-intensive monocropping and industrialized agriculture that has resulted to poor soil health and biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, as well as poverty and hunger among small-scale family farmers. Thus, we need to transform our food and agriculture, our food systems. But in what direction? And this is our key proposal. We transform it in the direction of agroecology, which is sustainable, climate resilient, and which addresses both adaptation and mitigation concerns, as well as concerns on health and nutrition and on reducing poverty and hunger. Agroecology is an integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social concepts and principles to the design and management of food and agriculture systems. Agroecology practices such as integrated, diversified organic farming, permaculture, food forests, crop rotation, composting, vermicomposting, reduced tillage, mulching contributes to a healthier soil. A coalition on agroecology has also been established as a result of the UN food system processes, with 24 governments committing to it, research institutions, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, and farmers' organizations, including AFA. The third aspect is how to incentivize soil health. How to incentivize soil health? We propose through scaling up and scaling out of agroecology. And to do this, we need policies like, first, secure rights to land, waters, and forests for family farmers, so we can decide what to plant, how to sell, and how to manage our landscape. Second, incentivize production based on agroecology and sustainable processing by small-scale family farmers, such as training of farmer technicians in every town, formal researchers collaborating with farmer scientists on participatory action researches, community-based seed systems, accessible soil analysis in every town, reforestation by local communities, public procurement of agroecologically produced food, price guarantees, trade fairs, easy and affordable credit, grants for equipment and facilities that can be shared among members of a group or cooperative, payment for environmental services they render, such as in water management, crop insurance, and support to transition to agroecology, because they lose out some income in the process for 1 to 3 years. Third, policy is empowering the agency of small-scale family farmers, providing spaces especially for women and young farmers to address their needs, recognizing their groups, making them equal partners in service delivery, in agri-research, innovation, in extension, and in policy making, and supporting the development and implementation of action plans for the implementation of the UN Decade of Family Farming. And last, policies that stop unsustainable, nature-destroying, people-harming projects, such as getting ancestral lands in favor of big mega dam projects, displacing indigenous peoples and threatening their livelihoods and securities, and stop reclaiming waters like bays, lakes, and seas for industrial and entertainment uses when coral reefs and livelihoods of small-scale fishers are at risk, and always conduct fair, true, free, and prior informed consent and support the organizing of small-scale family farmers in their own communities. So I hope we have shared something useful, and this can be considered in crafting the results of this event. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you for really raising this, the whole area around agroecology. We know there's a growing movement in this space, and even here at the CGIAR, we have a whole new initiative looking at this, testing solutions, living labs, and what you highlighted was the need we've got to have those incentives, as well as the new solution, because we know that pesticides and fertilizers, they do bring production yield, they do bring yields. So if we're going to take them in, we want those changes not to bring a loss to those farmers, those small scale farmers, that the margins there are very small. So thank you for bringing them into our discussions and some of the challenges that they face. So thank you. And then our last speaker for this session, before we go to the questions and answer, is Professor Edward Rhodes. Over to you, Edward.
Thank you, Rachel. My statement is on research data collection, informing government policy on soil health for sustainable agriculture. I do it within the perspective of a developing country in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll come back to this. I wish to showcase a research and government ministry initiative in Sierra Leone, West Africa, involving Jala University, the Sierra Leone Agricultural Research Institute, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, that is of relevance to policy making and reforms on soil health. As an example of policy reforms in the agricultural sector, I also bring to your attention that under a National Agricultural Transformation Program, the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry is channeling subsidies to farmers through the private sector and no longer directly to them to do. The National Agricultural Transformation Program also promotes evidence-based policy making, and in this regard, calls for updated maps and country-wide agricultural land use zoning. A National Comprehensive Soil and Related Natural Resources Survey is being implemented by these three actors, working together to assist in achieving some of the strategic goals of the National Agricultural Transformation Plan dealing with soils. The National Comprehensive Soil Survey represents, in a way, an example of the repurposing of agricultural policy at the donor level, because the value of the Comprehensive Soil and Related Natural Resources Survey was recognized only about midway during the implementation of a boosting agriculture and food security project. An addendum had to be prepared to allow for the allocation of funds to NCSS from the original budget. This survey has the potential to, one, promote the foundation for developing or adapting agricultural production technologies that are efficient and increase agricultural productivity, as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And two, to generate information for evidence-based policy formation or repurposing of sustainable agricultural development. I want to state here that any repurposing which leads to the decline of agricultural productivity is bound to fail in developing countries, where food security is a very, very important issue. In my country, in 2020, the WFP found that 48% of the country was food insecure, rising from 34% in 2019. So although we embrace the broad concept of soil health, the productivity aspect is of essence. The survey which I'm talking about, which is in progress, is collecting data on soil fertility, soil types, land suitability for cropping, vegetation land cover, and will delineate climatic regions and agricultural zones. It will also develop a soil database and information systems. In these ways, it will deliver evidence for policies on soil health pertaining to increasing agricultural productivity, for instance, crop yield, which is of crucial importance if you don't want to extend land use into protected areas. Also for protecting the soil against erosion by water. There's a lot of runoff in my country. My rainfall is about 2,000 to 4,000 millimeters within a period of just about 3 to 4 months. Restoring degraded lands, for example, the vast minor tracts of land in the mining areas, those who have diamonds and gold mining going on extensively. And also making use of finite natural resources sustainably, that is by proper land use. The survey will provide evidence on which the government fertilizer policy for enhancing fertilizer use efficiency on the highly weathered, very acidic, very low calcium exchange capacity, low nutrient status, and gravelly soils of Sierra Leone will be reviewed. In fact, for Sierra Leone, it's a case of building up fertility, not just maintaining the natural resource base. An early output of the survey has been the production of guidelines for the development of a national soil management strategy through multi-stakeholder consultation. Because as has been said before, you have to bring into the communities, the farmers, if you want to look at any sustainable soil management practice. We shall be using participate, learning, action, research, etc., so that we get to the roots of the problem and get the views of the people who hurts the most. The areas prioritized in the guidelines include definition of the role of soils played in mitigating and climate and biodiversity emergencies, and what could be done in the area of soil management to support the government in meeting its international commitments. The second priority is developing a special program on soil organic matter management, which will include integrated soil fertility management. And of course, this will be through it, we'll be able to incentivize government and farmers to improve carbon storage in the soil. The third priority will be the development of the necessary enabling conditions, including policies, infrastructure. For example, we need very good soil and fertilizer testing laboratories, and also we need to bring in fast and efficient methods of soil analysis, like dry analysis compared to the traditional wet analysis, which is presently done in most laboratories. We also want to invest in research and development, financial incentives, including those to support farmers to adopt efficient, high productivity technologies, institutional responsibilities, budgets, and public awareness campaigns to incentivize good soil stewardship. The survey is expected to be completed by the end of 2022, and the development of this soil management strategy within 12 months of the completion of the survey if funds become available. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rhodes. That was really fascinating, the National Comprehensive Soil Survey and what that can bring to forward planning, really being able to capture what the status of the soil is, and then how we can build on that. And you highlighted some of the changing practices and how we can try and lock up that organic matter into the soil system is going to be really important. So thank you to the 6 panelists so far for giving us wide-ranging insights from around the world. So we're now going to open up for questions, and I'm looking here at looking at some of the questions that are coming. So the first question, Lee, is to you. It says, what was the name of the program that you spoke about? I think it's the coalition. Can you give us a little bit more detail about that? Because it did seem to bring together so many of the aspects that have been highlighted by all our speakers.
Thank you so much for the question and the opportunity to highlight a bit more the Coalition of Action for Soil Health. The acronym actually stands for CASH. So this is a coalition that was rooted in the UN Food Systems Summit. So we remember the pre-summit was in July, and there was so much momentum that it was actually launched in September at the UN Food Systems Summit. It is an exciting coalition of member states and research, NGOs, private sector to really scale soil health practices globally. And as all the speakers before me have mentioned, this really requires public and private sector investment, financial investment to incentivize, to reward farmers for scaling soil health. But this requires that it's equitable and transparent, and that these incentives are not just having elite capture. So there's a very strong transparent and equity pillar, as well as the monitoring pillar and this enabling environment. So in order for investors to feel confident to invest in soil health, they need to we need to de-risk these investments. So that's where the monitoring comes in, and that's where the policy and enabling environment comes in. I think we're all familiar with the latest study that showed less than 20 countries included soil health in their NDCs and their nationally determined contributions. Several of those countries cited this need for robust monitoring that Sean was also mentioning. If they could only have access to these data, then they would be more likely to include soil health in the policy. So that's what the coalition aims to also achieve. Let's raise that number from 20. Let's get soil health in as many policies: climate change, restoration, agriculture. So Coalition of Action for Soil Health. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you so much for Lee, and we'll all be chasing up on that afterwards for sure. There is a question here from Ms. Sabani. And she says there is a belief that the use of chemicals can increase production and productivity. And we know that, we have seen that through the whole green revolution over the last 50 years. How can developing countries avoid the use of subsidies on these and move towards schemes addressing environmental issues so much that these countries still need more food to be self-sufficient? So this is really, how can we skip some of the destruction that we know those incentives would bring, and what can we bring as best practices to developing country? And I welcome anybody on the panel to be able to address that question. So what can the developing countries do to avoid the use of subsidies on these? Anybody like to take that question? Esther?
Yes, thank you. What we have seen in some of our countries in Asia, like for the Philippines, is, for example, we have a law on Organic Agriculture Act, and then the farmers who are going into organic agriculture, they are given support, in terms of grants and training and some loans to be able to do organic farming. Not 100%, because usually when you shift to 100% organic farming all at once, you really lose. For like some 3 years. But to transition gradually and then do some assistance in terms of the transition, in terms of the training, some grants, some seeds, like that can help. And we hope in some countries, again in the Philippines, if we want to shift to climate resilient agriculture, but farmers still see that the government is subsidizing chemical fertilizers and not subsidizing, for example, the organic or the climate resilient way, farmers will still choose the chemical way. So it's really very important that governments prioritize grants and support or subsidies to to climate resilient agroecological approaches and do not have conflicting policies on this.
Thank you for that, Esther. And absolutely, it's repurposing those subsidies and making sure there's no conflict in that policy agenda to promote that. I now have a question for all the panels. So I'd like you to, in turn, answer this, think about this. The opening remarks talk to the need to deliver triple wins for the people, climate, and nature. Could the panel talk to the key challenges presented in their examples and how they are seeking to navigate those challenges to deliver triple wins as they described? So we're looking at triple wins. I know, Wolfgang, you spoke about this in the state of Germany. Would you like to start it? And then I will ask the other panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can try. I mean, it's, as I mentioned, our policy has a really participative approach, and we not only talk to each other, we are conducting policies and communication which are related to all these three elements at least. And I think that's the important point, that you not talk about agriculture, and agriculture is the main thing, not thinking about nature, biodiversity, not thinking about the consumer. If you only think about the consumer and not about agriculture and the income of farmers. So you have to have the whole picture in your policy mix. And I think that's very important. And that's also the aim of the policy action agenda, which is the background for future discussions. Probably so far as a start.
That's great, Wolfgang. Sean, would you like to give us some insight? People, climate, and nature.
Climate and nature. I mean, this is ultimately, if we get this right, we shouldn't have to make any compromise between any of these things. I think the pressure is, and this has come through also on the previous question, is how to produce, cheap food that people can afford. How can you get the right number of calories, to people in a way that they can afford? And the way we've done that, until now, is that we've excluded the cost of the environment in many ways. If you include that, it can make it difficult to afford. So really, part of the problem is how do you, who pays for that environmental cost? How do we build that in? How do we price that in? And there are different ways of doing that. And I guess the one that I presented to you is that we feel that there is a role for government to subsidize, to cover that cost, so that those who can least afford, in countries like mine, many people can't afford organic food because it includes that extra cost. So, we have one way of doing that is to bring in government subsidy. There are other ways in terms of how you support people's livelihoods as a whole. But essentially, we have to find a way of covering that cost and bringing that pricing in. And I think incentives is quite a good way of doing that. Getting the price of the cost of the level of those incentives right is the tricky bit. And I guess that's the point at which we're at now, getting that transition right. And as Esther said, getting that support right for farmers as they go through that transition is key, because otherwise you can lose a load of people in the process and it can backfire. So that's where we're at now, and that's what we're trying to do.
And thank you, Sean. And Lee, could you talk to the challenges that you see in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really exciting to have this paradigm shift finally, that we need to focus on multiple indicators. We need to focus on healthy people, climate action, nature, because previously, a lot of the efforts around food system really had one target, and we know what that was. That was about increasing yields. And now we really need to work in interdisciplinary teams, as Sean was mentioning, to tackle and address the multi-dimensions of our landscapes. And I completely agree that we need to get the incentives right. And we also need to acknowledge that not everyone is working with us. So it's about making sure everyone is at the table, doing your stakeholder network analysis. We're doing that in India and Kenya right now around natural farming, and seeing who are the influencers. Are they working for people, nature, and climate? Is it for profit? And getting everyone together, because actually we all share the same earth. So let me close with Dr. Ratan Lal's mantra, because Esther mentioned it earlier. Healthy soil equals healthy food, equals healthy people and animals, and equals a healthy planet.
And thank you. We take that on board, that wonderful mantra. Edward, would you like to bring some insight on the challenges that you're seeing?
Yes, but first of all, let me comment on the question of subsidy. Like I said, I think it should be a transition. I mentioned that government has now moved from subsidizing farmers directly to passing the subsidies through private agencies. This increases efficiency and lessens the burden on government and ensures that the subsidy reaches the farmers. Because in the past, subsidies were criticized because it did not benefit the farmers to whom it was intended. I think the triple wins can be achieved if you subsidize or incentivize farmers to adopt technologies which are efficient. That is, the results in high yields. They also result in less pollution of the environment. For instance, we don't want excessive use of nitrogen fertilizers or wrong use of nitrogen fertilizers. Because, in fact, IFDC, the International Fertilizer Development Center, developed a kind of injection applier for urea, in which the urea is placed in the reduced zone of the soil. You know, when you have a flooded soil, the upper zones are aerated, and as you go down, you get to the reduced zone. But it's difficult for farmers to actually place the fertilizers in the correct zone. But with this applicator, which was developed by IFDC, you can inject the urea supergranules into the reduced zone. When it's in the ammonium form, it's stable. It's when it gets up in an aerated situation that it converts to nitrate, and then you get to nitrous oxide and that kind of stuff. So research and development has an important technology. It is not a question of inventing the wheel. Some of these technologies are already available, like the one I mentioned. It's a question of adapting, testing it. For instance, I talked about the survey we're doing. We're going to delineate the country into different agroclimatic zones, different agroecological zones, and see how they work for each of these zones. The question of concern for climate and soil, which relates to the other dimensions of soil health, all the developing countries attended the COP26, or at least most, at least I know that my country, and we signed up, we have what they call intended nationally determined contributions. So we intend to keep to those contributions, and if you do those things, you will help to mitigate and reduce climate change. I mentioned soil organic matter, a special program on soil organic matter, and it will involve what we refer to as integrated soil fertility management. From my own experience of several years working on highly infertile soils, which are inherently fertile, very, very old parent materials, now the soils are so acidic, you need some amount of fertilizer use. Fertilizers and organic materials, that is the solution. Each of them have...
Thank you. Thank you, Edward. And that's fascinating about the multi-areas that we can bring in. And I'd like to ask Esther that, just to finish us out, to address that question. What are the challenges to meet to facilitate, to realize the dream of the triple win?
Yes, we have seen the realization of the triple win in many of our farmer members who really have adopted climate resilient agriculture, sustainable agriculture, agroecology. Just recently, like I think last December, we had several case studies. And what we saw is that, what we realized is that first, when we asked them, how did you shift? Why did you shift to sustainable agroecology? First is they learned about it. Now they learned about it. And how did they learn about it? They attended trainings, both from the government and the non-government organizations and the farmers organizations. They went to many farm visits, field visits, and they became inspired. Okay? So when they became inspired, they needed to have some money to invest. So as what our colleague from Sierra Leone said, financing must be channeled to these practices that support the triple wins, that is sustainable, that do agroecology. So from maybe instead of subsidizing chemical fertilizers, why don't we train them on how to do organic fertilizers? Or farm cooperatives who produce organic fertilizers be able to supply the farmers who need it. And there's like a public procurement. So things like this. Mindset, get the farmers excited about it. And when they are excited, support it through the many incentives that we can give, you know, in terms of subsidies and grants and training and research and extension. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. And you've highlighted, just to close out, unfortunately, we could have spent many more hours here, but you highlighted the multi-dimensions of addressing this key problem. For all those that are joining us in this live event, I'm sure you would like to join me in thanking our wonderful speakers. We have had such a rich sharing of insights and experiences. So the next part is we're able to go to a deep dive. So Esther, Edward, and Sean will be able to go out to you. You'll be able to join these deep dive rooms, and it will be an informal conversation that's self-moderated. So you can ask more of those questions that we just didn't have time to address today. In the chat, the Madha's report is given there, and I'm sure we will also add details about Cashly. They're asking for more details to the link to that website. So thank you very much for all those who have joined us today. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to FCDO for bringing us all together in this wonderful event. Thank you very much, and stay safe. Goodbye.